I still remember exactly how the lights felt on my skin. Too bright, too hot. The kind that made your eyes water if you stared too long. I was standing just behind the heavy black curtain of the stage, heart racing in my chest, holding my breath while pretending not to care. The company I had poured my soul into for 2 years, my late nights, my weekends, my ideas, was finally about to go public with our big win. And I was told to stay backstage. Because I was just the intern. The voice of our new CEO, Mason, rang out across the auditorium, slick and confident like it always was. Today marks a milestone. Our startup Nexora has reached a valuation of $45 million, thanks to the brilliant leadership of our team and the relentless innovation of our engineers. Applause erupted. Except the lead engineer wasn't on stage, because that would have been me. And I wasn't even invited to sit in the front row. Just 2 years earlier, I had walked into Nexora with a tattered backpack, a burning idea, and a portfolio of messy code. I was still finishing my computer science degree. I wasn't anyone's first choice. I didn't have connections. I didn't wear blazers or speak in buzzwords. But I knew what users wanted. I knew how to build a product that worked. And more importantly, I cared. Cared in the way only underdogs do, when they have nothing to lose and everything to prove. The app that launched Nexora into the spotlight? I designed the wireframes on a napkin at a sandwich shop. I wrote the first 10,000 lines of code alone in my bedroom, fueled by instant noodles and Spotify playlists called Don't Give Up Yet. And yet here I was, standing in the dark while Mason smiled for the cameras, saying things like, "Our breakthrough AI features were a team effort, and we've built something extraordinary together." Together. He hadn't even been hired until we were already in beta testing. He'd walked in 6 months ago, all charm and spreadsheets, shaking hands like he owned the place. The board loved him. He had vision, the kind that involved meetings and golf and buzzwords like scalability and monetization. He never asked me about the app's infrastructure. He never stayed late when servers crashed. He never once thanked me personally. But he did know how to take credit. When I approached him before the event to ask if I'd be on stage too, just for a moment, maybe to demo the app I wrote, he smiled without smiling. "Lizzie, you're so valuable to the team," he said. "But this event is about optics. Investors don't need to meet every coder behind the curtain." Every coder. Like I was just one of many. I wanted to say something. Anything. But the lump in my throat had already formed, and I knew if I opened my mouth, something embarrassing might come out. So I just nodded. And now, backstage, I watched him call out names. The lead innovation officer who once called JavaScript Java whatever. The PR director who still didn't know how to update her phone. The guy who wrote our website copy. And got a front row seat. And not once did he say my name. At the end of the event, they rolled out the new team slide. My heart skipped when the screen lit up. There I was. Except I wasn't. My photo was gone. My name, my title, erased like I never existed. I stood frozen as the audience clapped, my face flushed with shame, then rage, then something colder. Clarity, because they didn't just overlook me. They erased me on purpose. 2 days later, I woke up to a different kind of betrayal. I opened my laptop, typed in my login, and got an error message. Access denied. Slack? Disconnected. Email? Disabled. Even my company badge stopped working. They had cut me off. No warning, no call. Not even a courtesy email. Just gone. The same app they were now showcasing to investors, to press, to the world, was still running. Still branded as Nexora's crown jewel. But the version they had copied before cutting me out? It wasn't the final version. And it didn't contain the one thing they needed most. The heartbeat of the system. The real-time logic engine I had written from scratch. Because what they didn't know, what Mason never bothered to ask, was that the working code they kept was actually a placeholder. And the real engine was still sitting in my private Git repository, waiting. As I stared at the lifeless login screen, I felt the panic that had started to rise melt into something else. A slow, deliberate smile. They had no idea what they had just done. Not yet. But they were about to find out. I spent the next few hours in silence. Not sad, not angry, just still. My apartment was quiet, save for the low hum of my monitor and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was the kind of silence you get right before a storm. And in that stillness, I opened my private repository. The real one. The one with the full production engine. The one they didn't even know existed. You see, I learned the hard way during my first internship that companies love to cut corners when the stakes get high. I had written a beautiful analytics tool for a marketing firm once, only to be dismissed without warning the day it was finished. They used my code anyway. I had no contract, no protection, no leverage. I was 19. I cried for a week, but not this time. This time, I built safeguards. The version Nexora was currently running, the one they copied from my shared dev folder, was a safe build. It looked like it worked. It even passed the basic unit tests. But without the real-time logic engine, it was just a pretty interface wrapped around empty promises. The data parsing wouldn't scale. The AI modules were hard-coded. And worst of all, the billing integration was incomplete. If they rolled out this version to international users, like Mason promised at the press conference, it would crash. Not maybe. Not possibly. It would fail. Payment would loop. Data would stall, and worst-case scenario, they'd trigger fraud detection protocols from major gateways. The kind of failure that leaves a mark. Still, I wasn't rushing to pull the trigger. Not yet. I wasn't out for revenge. I was out for recognition. For truth. For dignity. I wanted them to know exactly what they had done. And more importantly, why it mattered. I called Noah first. Noah was one of the original co-founders. Quiet, brilliant, awkward in meetings, but always respectful. He'd gone part-time after a family emergency and wasn't involved in the press event. But I knew he would care. When he picked up, I barely had to say anything. My name alone made him pause. "Lizzie," he said, "I've been trying to reach you. What's going on? Your Slack account disappeared." "They removed me," I said flatly. "What?" "I woke up this morning and everything was gone. No access, no email. They erased me." He was silent for a moment. Then, "That doesn't make sense. You wrote the engine?" "Noah," I said carefully. "They're running the wrong build." Another pause. "The pre-release version?" "The placeholder," I confirmed. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "Oh my God. Do they know?" "They will," I said. "Soon." He didn't say much after that. Just, "I'll call you back." And then the line went dead. While I waited, I pulled up the public dashboard Mason had proudly shown off at the event. It looked impressive. Charts, user metrics, a map pulsing with live interactions. But I knew the truth. Those metrics were cached. Old data being replayed from a static file. A trick. A lie. And as they pushed the app out to our early international beta users, I knew what was coming. A few hours later, my phone buzzed again. Noah. "They're panicking," he said. "Support is getting flooded. Billing is failing. Customers can't log in. The dev team doesn't know what's wrong. Mason's losing it." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Instead, I felt a strange ache in my chest. Because I didn't want the app to fail. I'd built it to help people. Small business owners trying to automate their client scheduling, freelancers trying to manage leads. It was never supposed to be a trophy for executives. It was supposed to mean something. And now it was burning. Because I wasn't invited to the table. Noah continued. "I told them to call you. I said they needed to fix this, and you were the only one who could." I shook my head. "Too late for that." "You're sure?" "They deleted me, Noah. They removed my name from the codebase, from the website. They chose this. He sighed. What are you going to do? I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. But they need to learn. This isn't just about ownership or credit. It's about trust. About knowing the difference between using people and building with them. Before we hung up, Noah said one more thing. They thought you were disposable, he said. But it turns out you are the foundation. And those words stuck with me. That night, I received my first email from Mason since being removed. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even direct. It came through the CTO, a guy I barely knew. Subject line, urgent build request. Please advise. Body. Hi, Lizzie. We're experiencing unexpected issues with the latest deployment. Would appreciate your insight on some legacy code integration. Are you available for a quick sync? Legacy code. They were already trying to reframe it, as if my engine was a ghost from the past instead of the core of everything they were showcasing. I didn't reply. I just watched the system status page flicker from operational to partial outage. And I knew. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the headlines started to trickle in. Not from the big outlets, yet, but from the tech blogs that watch startups like Nexora, like Hawks. Nexora's breakthrough app stumbles during global rollout. Payment failures, login glitches, what's going on at Nexora? Valuation high, functionality low, is Nexora all talk? I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through the articles with a calm I didn't entirely recognize. There was no joy in it, no schadenfreude. Just a quiet satisfaction that truth, for once, wasn't being buried. I poured coffee into my favorite mug. It said, "Trust me, I'm the dev." Ironic now. My inbox had ballooned overnight, from silence to chaos. Messages from junior developers I used to mentor, former interns, even a few members of marketing. They didn't know the whole story, but they knew something was wrong. They could feel the shift in the air. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. Instead, I opened the email from Nexora's CTO again. I stared at that line. Legacy code integration. And reread it slowly. They wanted access, not understanding. A solution, not a conversation. And certainly not accountability. But then something unexpected happened. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Same number. On the third call, I picked up. Lizzie, it's Michelle. From the board, I blinked. Michelle? I'm sorry to call directly, but Mason's been less than forthcoming with answers. I asked point blank about the app's architecture. He dodged. Then I saw your name was gone from the team page. I put 2 and 2 together. I stayed silent. I want to hear your side of the story, she added. So I told her. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. I explained the development path, the original architecture, the stripped-down placeholder version they'd copied. I explained how I'd built a layered permission system for the app's logic engine, and how that engine was never committed to the shared repo. I told her about the access denial, the erasure, the email calling my work legacy code. When I finished, Michelle exhaled. I had a feeling, she said. You're not the first brilliant mind I've seen pushed out by ego. But I promise you, you won't be the last to stand up and get your name back. I wanted to believe her. Are you calling on behalf of the board? I asked. No, she said. I'm calling because I'm tired of watching founders and CEOs pretend products fall from the sky. We invest in people, not just press conferences. That sentence hit deeper than I expected. Then she asked the question that changed everything. If we invited you to speak at an emergency stakeholder meeting, would you come? I hesitated. My gut screamed yes. My heart whispered no. I wasn't looking to grandstand. I wasn't interested in payback. Not if it meant becoming like them. But I also knew this was a chance. Maybe the only chance to set the record straight. On my terms. I'll consider it, I said finally. But only if I can speak freely. No PR edits. No slide decks. Just the truth. Michelle didn't pause. You'll have the floor. By the end of the day, I received an official calendar invite. Emergency shareholder briefing. App stability. Infrastructure and strategic oversight. It was scheduled for Friday, 3 days from now. 3 days. I spent the first night drafting notes. Not a speech, just a truth map. What I'd built, how it worked, why it mattered. I included diagrams, timelines, snippets of real commits with my GitHub signature. Everything time-stamped, documented, indisputable. On the second day, Mason finally reached out. A voicemail again. His voice, for the first time, didn't sound smug. It sounded strained. Lizzie, hey, look, I realize there have been some miscommunications. I think we both know there's been pressure on all sides, and I may have made some assumptions that weren't fair. Let's put that behind us. I'd really like to sit down and work through this. No apology, just negotiation. It confirmed everything I already knew. Mason didn't want to make things right. He wanted to make them quiet. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Michelle. I'll be there Friday, I said, and I'll bring everything. That night, I sat on my balcony as the city buzzed below. The skyline was a mess of blinking lights in motion, but I felt oddly still, like the eye of a storm. Because this wasn't just about an app anymore. It was about being erased. And now, I had a seat at the table. Friday came like a quiet avalanche, the kind you feel building days before it hits. But when it finally arrives, everything is too still, too controlled, too rehearsed. I dressed carefully that morning. Not for them. For me. A charcoal blazer over a simple blouse. No flashy logos, no power heels. Just comfort, clarity, and control. I tied my hair back the way I used to when coding late into the night. When the world disappeared and only the logic remained. By 9 a.m., I arrived at Nexora headquarters. I didn't take the employee entrance. I walked straight through the front doors, past the gleaming wall-sized screens flashing user growth stats, and into the main elevator, where the receptionist offered me a forced smile. They're expecting you on floor 7, Ms. Lin. Thanks, I said, voice calm. The doors closed behind me. Floor 7 was normally reserved for major investor presentations. It had frosted glass, white walls, and the kind of minimalist furniture that screams, "We spent more on this room than your salary last year." It was perfect for what I had in mind. When the elevator opened, I was met by Michelle and 2 other board members. All 3 stood, greeted me formally, but their eyes held something different. Recognition. Not just of my presence, but of my importance. We shook hands. Inside the conference room, the table was already full. Mason was there, of course, sitting at the head with his usual overconfidence and a stack of papers he wouldn't read. The CTO sat to his left, expression tight. Legal counsel, a few investors, and a handful of senior engineers filled out the rest. There were laptops, coffees, nervous glances, but not a single smile. I sat across from Mason, didn't speak, didn't look away. Michelle opened the meeting. We're here today to clarify the origin, structure, and current integrity of the Nexora platform. Lizzie Lin has requested to present her contributions directly. She looked at me. Lizzie, you have the floor. I stood slowly, unzipping the slim black portfolio I'd brought with me. No slides, just facts. I'm not here for drama, I said, and I'm not here to rehash personal slights. I'm here to show you what's real. I passed around printed documents, diagrams, timestamps, Git commits, technical overviews. I had highlighted the logic engine that served as the app's core, complete with version histories and digital signatures that traced back to me. Then I pulled out a printed version of the internal codebase, the placeholder version Mason had launched with. I flipped to the billing integration module. This is the version Nexora deployed to its beta users during global rollout, I said, tapping the paper. This line here, it loops payment tokens without resolving the final transaction state. It's a sandbox loop, meant for testing. Mason's face started to shift. Here's the version I never uploaded to the main repo, I continued, sliding a second packet forward. Fully tested, PCI compliant, live token ready. It's housed in my private repository, which I can prove was built entirely on my own time and hardware outside of Nexora servers. I paused. Then I looked him dead in the eye. You never asked how it worked. You just assumed it would. The silence that followed was dense. Michelle leaned forward. Lizzie, to be clear, you're saying the app's core engine was never actually owned by the company? I'm saying the deployed version was incomplete, and the complete version, the one that works, is mine. Legal scribbled furiously. Mason finally spoke. This is absurd, he said, laughing hollowly. She was an intern, an hourly developer. I wasn't an intern. I cut in, voice sharp but steady. Not by title, not by contribution. And every employment agreement I signed gave me IP rights to self-built tools not submitted to Nexora's repository. I turned to the CTO. You knew. You saw the placeholder commit. You signed off anyway. He paled. Michelle raised a hand. Let's stay focused. Lizzie, can the stable engine be implemented today? Yes, I said, but not by accident, not by force, only by trust, and with a real agreement this time. Mason laughed again, but nobody followed. I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, one of the investors spoke. So, what exactly do you want, Lizzie? I looked at him, clear-eyed. A title that matches my contribution, a contract that protects my work, and the ability to rebuild this product the way it was meant to be built, from the inside out. And if we say no, I stood. Then the version you have keeps breaking, and when the press asks what happened to your star product, I'll tell the truth. Another pause. Michelle looked around the room. We'll take a short recess. Everyone stood, except Mason. He stayed in his seat, jaw tight, knuckles white around the arms of his chair. And for the first time, he looked afraid. Not of me, but of what I represented. The recess lasted exactly 17 minutes. I spent them alone, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows just outside the conference room. Below, the city buzzed like it always did. Cars threading through intersections, people rushing in and out of glass buildings. But up here, everything felt suspended. Behind me, voices rose and fell. Mason's louder than the rest, filled with bluster. I didn't need to hear the words to know what he was saying. It was classic. Deflect, minimize, redirect. I had seen it before. In meetings, in classrooms, in life. Men like Mason didn't fear being wrong. They feared being exposed. The doors opened. Michelle stepped out. They're ready for you, she said softly. I walked back in calmly. This time the atmosphere had shifted. Investors sat straighter. Legal had stopped taking notes and started watching me. Mason still wore the same suit, but he looked like it fit differently now, like he was sweating through it. Michelle took her seat and glanced around the room. We've reviewed the documentation, verified timestamps, and consulted legal regarding IP ownership. She looked at me. We're prepared to make an offer. I sat back down. Let's hear it. She turned to the head of legal, who cleared his throat and read from a printed sheet. Nexora is prepared to offer reinstatement as lead product architect, retroactive title adjustment, full credit on all public documentation of the Nexora app, and a permanent seat on the Product Oversight Committee. In addition, a new employment contract will grant shared rights to any future core engine development, with a profit-sharing clause attached. Mason opened his mouth, but a sharp glance from Michelle stopped him cold. I was silent. Not because I was unsure. Because I wanted the silence to stretch. I needed them to feel the weight of what they were asking. Not just the technical fix, but the human cost of erasing someone and then expecting a seamless return. I want one more thing, I said finally. Heads turned. I want written protection for any developer on my team. Past, present or future. No NDA threats, no quiet terminations, no ghosting contributors. We work transparently or we don't work at all. One of the investors raised a brow. That's a pretty strong demand. I met his eyes. So is building your product from scratch. Michelle gave a small nod. Approved. And Mason? I asked, turning to him for the first time that hour. What's his role moving forward? Michelle looked at the other board members. There was a quiet exchange of nods. Effective immediately, she said. Mason will step down from CEO duties. He'll remain in an advisory role until the end of the quarter, after which the board will revisit his future with the company. I nodded. Then we have a deal, Mason finally snapped. This is ridiculous, he barked, standing up. You're giving her everything because of a few bugs? She was an intern. You think she can run a company? No, Michelle said calmly, but she can build one. And that's more than you've done. The room went still. Mason looked around, hoping for support. But none came. Then he looked at me. You'll regret this, he said under his breath. I stood slowly. No, Mason. You will. Because when you call someone just the intern, what you're really saying is, I can't recognize value unless it comes in a suit and tie. He left without another word. After the meeting, I returned to my apartment and collapsed into my desk chair. The silence was no longer heavy. It was liberating. I opened my inbox, flooded. Developers I'd worked with in the past, a few old professors, even tech reporters sniffing around the app's crash and mysterious architecture issues. I ignored the press. Instead, I opened a blank document titled, New Foundations, Rebuilding the Nexora Core. This time, I wasn't doing it alone. The next week, I assembled a small team. People who had been pushed out quietly. Coders who never spoke up in meetings but always delivered. Designers who had ideas but were told they didn't match the brand. I brought them in. We started reviewing everything. Code, UX, scalability, the works. We restructured the logic engine, implemented real-time performance tracking, rebuilt the billing module with multilingual UI and full accessibility. We didn't just fix the broken pieces. We made them better. And this time, every contributor's name went into the credits. No exceptions. At the next all-hands meeting, I stood at the front of the room. No curtain, no backstage pass, no dimmed identity. I wasn't introduced as a genius or a hero. Just, this is Lizzie. She's the reason we're still standing. And that was enough. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Not entirely. Because legacies don't vanish with pink slips. They linger. And Mason? He wasn't finished. The quiet didn't last long. 2 weeks after the rebuild launched, Nexora was back in the headlines. This time for the right reasons. The new architecture was praised. The international rollout resumed without a glitch. Customer feedback surged with 5-star ratings, and investors exhaled. A few even called it a rare redemption arc in tech. But behind the headlines, something else was brewing. I started noticing it in small ways first. An error message that wasn't mine. A calendar meeting invite I never sent. Then one morning, I opened my personal laptop and found an attempt to reset my email password. 3 times. It wasn't random. It was targeted. I knew who it was before I even asked. Mason. He still had contacts inside. Loyalists. People who didn't care what he'd done. Only what he represented. Money, status, power. And I was the symbol of everything he lost. So he did what people like him always do when they lose control. He tried to poison the well. False complaints about hostile leadership. Anonymous HR tips claiming I was erratic, emotionally unstable. One even said I'd falsified my credentials. All of them easily disproven. But it didn't matter. The whispers had begun. And I knew from experience, whispers can be more dangerous than outright lies. I sat in my new office one evening, staring at a Post-it on my wall. It had 3 words scribbled in Sharpie. Build, prove, protect. It was a mantra I wrote during my first year at Nexora, back when I still thought being great at your job was enough to earn respect. Now I understood that being great wasn't the end. It was the beginning. You had to protect what you built. That week, I initiated an internal audit. Again, this time I led it myself, with full authority from the board. I brought in third-party digital forensics. We checked logs, firewall attempts, even non-company devices pinging internal systems. It wasn't just about catching Mason. It was about sending a message. That this was a different Nexora now. 3 days into the audit, we found it. A cloned login string pinged from an old contractor's IP address. That contractor had been referred by Mason months ago. Someone who never completed onboarding, but whose credentials still worked. Buried in an inactive user list. I brought it straight to the board. Michelle's expression was unreadable at first. Then she said, "He's still trying to run this place from outside." "He's trying to burn it down," I said. She leaned back in her chair. "Then maybe it's time we make it official." That afternoon, the board convened and voted. Unanimous. Mason's advisory contract was terminated. All remaining access revoked. A formal statement was prepared. Not for the press, but for us, the people who actually built the company. It read, "Leadership is not a title. It's a responsibility. Nexora acknowledges and condemns the actions that undermined that responsibility. We stand by the builders." It was more than I expected, more than I needed, but not more than we deserved. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, no signature. Just one sentence written in neat, sharp handwriting. "Congratulations. Enjoy your little empire." For now. I didn't even flinch. Because here's the thing. I had already won. Not by retaliation, not by sabotage, but by enduring the storm and refusing to give away my name. I didn't just build code. I built culture. I built boundaries. And I built the kind of company I wish had existed when I was 19, crying in my dorm room after being fired the first time someone stole my work. That version of me? She would be proud of this one. Now, every new dev hired at Nexora gets a small welcome kit. Laptop, onboarding docs, and a hardcover notebook with our 3 words stamped in bold on the cover. Build, prove, protect. And inside, the very first page reads, "Your ideas matter. You matter. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Some ask if it's overkill, a bit dramatic, too sentimental for tech. But those people never had their names erased from something they bled to build. I walk the halls now and people nod, smile, make eye contact. Not because I intimidate them, but because they see me. They know what I stood through and what I stood for. And that, more than any press release, any payout, any shiny new office chair, is what I'll carry forward. Not just as Lizzie the architect, not even as Lizzie the leader, but as Lizzie, the girl who stayed quiet once, and then rewrote the story. I still remember the sound of the champagne popping. The smell of lemon butter and char-grilled salmon filled the banquet hall. Our servers, some of whom had been with us for over a decade, moved between the round tables like clockwork. The walls were decorated with framed photos. Opening day, the first feature in Bon Appetit, our 3rd location ribbon cutting. It was our 25th anniversary. A quarter century of Sorella, the family restaurant I had poured my entire adult life into. We were celebrating at a hotel ballroom in Chicago, where our original restaurant had opened its doors back in 1999. I had just turned 36. I'd been running the business since I was 26, stepping in after my father's heart attack. At first, they just needed someone to keep the doors open. But I stayed, grew it, scaled it, and built Sorella into something bigger than any of them had imagined. So when my Uncle Frank tapped his fork against a wine glass and stood to give a speech, I assumed I knew what was coming. A tribute to my father. maybe a few kind words about me. Instead, he turned to my cousin David. "I just want to take a moment," he said, smiling proudly, "to recognize someone who's shown incredible promise. Someone who truly understands what Sorella means to this family. The future of this brand. The person I believe will lead us into the next 25 years. My son, David." There was a pause, then clapping. I looked around the room. The applause spread quickly. My aunt, my cousins, two of the investors I had brought in years ago. Even the lawyer we hired last year to oversee the Arizona location stood and raised a glass. I just blinked. David smiled awkwardly, like he hadn't known it was coming. But I knew better. His modesty was too well rehearsed. I forced a smile and took a sip of my drink, the bitterness cutting sharper than the alcohol. The kind of smile you wear when you're surrounded by people who just voted you out of your own story and didn't even have the decency to warn you first. I found an excuse to step outside, claiming I needed to take a call. In reality, I just needed to breathe. For 10 years, I had sacrificed everything. Nights, weekends, relationships. I skipped birthdays, gave up 2 job offers from national chains, and cashed out my 401k to help open the second location. It was my strategy that got us into the airport food court contract. My late nights that landed us a glowing write-up in food and wine. My name on the credit applications when no one else would sign. David? He joined 2 years ago, worked part-time in marketing. He made a few flashy videos for TikTok, suggested a new logo, and showed up to one zoning meeting where he fell asleep halfway through. But he was Frank's son. And Frank, being my dad's older brother, still carried the illusion that he was the true patriarch of the brand. Later that night, I walked back into the ballroom. People were mingling, laughing. Someone had already ordered cake. I didn't confront anyone. I just smiled, posed for a few pictures, let them believe I didn't care. Because they had no idea what they'd just done. I had learned the hard way that family and business don't always mix. That's why, 4 years ago, when we opened the franchise in Austin, I hired my own legal counsel and insisted on reviewing every operating contract personally. At the time, they thought I was paranoid, overly cautious. But it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next morning, I arrived at the flagship restaurant in River North at 6:45 a.m., before the rest of the team. I always did on Mondays. It gave me time to go through invoices and prep for the weekly operations call. At 7:30, Frank and David walked in. Their faces said everything. "Sophie," Frank started, not even looking guilty, "we've decided it's time for a transition. David will be stepping in as managing director." I didn't blink. I just folded my laptop shut, stood up, and looked at them both. "Okay," I said. "But you might want to double-check the franchise contracts before you get too comfortable." David frowned. "Why?" I grabbed my folder from the filing cabinet, pulled out a copy, and tapped the paragraph I had highlighted years ago. "Because if I'm removed from operational leadership without just cause," I said calmly, "those contracts are subject to immediate review and may be invalidated under the non-compete clause." Frank's face fell. David just stared. They had no idea, but they were about to find out. David stood frozen, the paper in his hands trembling slightly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Frank leaned in to read over his shoulder, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the clause I had pointed to. Section 7.4, Leadership Clause. In the event of a leadership transition involving the removal or replacement of the operational director without cause, the franchise licensing agreement shall be subject to legal review, with full discretion granted to the original operational signatory. They hadn't read it. I could tell by their faces. They'd signed those documents when we launched the Austin and Denver locations, treating it like paperwork, not realizing the power they had handed me in the fine print. "You're bluffing," Frank said finally, his voice low and tight. I raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" I reached into my bag and handed him a second folder. "This is a legal summary prepared by the same attorney who reviewed all 4 of our franchise agreements. Her contact information is on the inside cover. Feel free to give her a call. David looked up, color draining from his face. Wait, this clause gives you the right to suspend operations? If I'm removed without board approval and without written cause, I replied calmly, which neither of you have. You're not on the board, Frank snapped. True, I said, but I do control the franchise operations. You signed that over in 2019 when I personally invested in our expansion. You needed capital, remember? No bank would touch us without a proven operations executive. Frank went quiet. I could see the wheels spinning in his head, trying to recall every step he had taken. But the truth was, I had been one step ahead for years. I hadn't expected to need it. But I'd learned enough watching how decisions got made behind closed doors to know that if the day ever came, I needed to protect what I built. David looked like he was about to be sick. So, what does this mean? It means, I said, if you try to proceed with removing me, I have the legal authority to halt all franchise activity, pending litigation. That includes vendor agreements, supply chains, kitchen licensing, and employee contracts at every single franchise location. David opened his mouth, then shut it again. Frank was still glaring at me, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. You knew we might do this, he said quietly. I nodded. I knew it was possible. Not because I thought you were evil, just careless, entitled. You've always treated Sorella like a family inheritance, but it wasn't handed to me. I earned every square inch of it. Frank let out a bitter laugh. You think you're the only one who's worked hard for this family? No, I said evenly. But I am the only one who turned a failing restaurant into a multi-million-dollar brand while the rest of you sat back and collected dividend checks. He took a step forward. You don't want to start a war, Sophie. I met his gaze. Then don't start one. The silence stretched between us for a long moment. David looked from me to his father, then back again. So, what now? I took a breath. Now, I suggest we do what we should have done in the first place. Talk to the board. Call an emergency meeting. Let them weigh in. But if either of you moves forward without due process, I'll file for injunctions this afternoon. Frank muttered something under his breath. I'm not trying to burn this place down, I added, but I'm not letting you erase me either. With that, I turned and walked out of the office, my pulse hammering in my ears. Once outside, I didn't go back to work. I got in my car and drove straight to my lawyer's office downtown. She had already read the room better than I had months ago when I'd asked her to double-check all operational clauses, just in case. I had a feeling you'd be in today, she said, waving me into her office. They actually did it, I said, sitting down. They tried to replace me. She sighed and pulled out a legal pad. Do you want to fight this quietly or publicly? I hesitated, then said, let's start quiet. But be ready to go loud. I left her office with a signed affidavit in my bag and copies of all 4 franchise agreements in my hand. Back at the restaurant, the tension had already shifted. Staff were whispering. Our general manager, Luis, gave me a silent nod as I walked in. He had heard. The battle had officially begun. But what Frank and David didn't know? I wasn't just fighting to keep my job. I was fighting to protect everything I had built from the very people who thought they could steal it and get away with it. The following morning, I arrived at the restaurant before the sun rose. Not because I had to, because I needed to. I wanted to see who would show up, who would greet me like they always had, and who would avoid eye contact. In a family business, loyalty is rarely about performance. It's about blood. And I was about to find out just how much of that loyalty was real. Luis, our general manager, was already prepping the kitchen for the lunch shift. He looked up and gave me a half smile. Morning, boss. I nodded. Thanks for being here. He gave a small shrug. This place only runs because of you. We all know that. I was grateful, but I didn't let it show. I was too used to people changing their minds the moment power shifted, so I kept my guard up. By 8 a.m., The whispers had begun. Word had gotten out. Frank and David had told a few department heads that I'd be stepping aside and that David would be taking over the transition, effective immediately. It wasn't a formal announcement, but it was enough to rattle people. And they had timed it well. Tuesday was our supplier meeting, where we usually reviewed monthly orders, new menu items, and expansion updates. This time, it felt more like a silent war zone. I walked into the meeting room to find a few longtime staff already seated. Maria from marketing, John from operations, and Elise, our finance director. David stood at the front, awkwardly shuffling papers like he had something important to say. Frank wasn't in the room, but his presence lingered in every stiffened back and averted gaze. David cleared his throat. Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for their ongoing commitment during this exciting new chapter. I sat down at the far end of the table, arms folded. David glanced at me but didn't meet my eyes. As you've probably heard, he continued, there's been a shift in leadership. Starting this week, I'll be overseeing daily operations. According to who? I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. The room froze. David hesitated. We, made the decision as a family. That's not how operational leadership is determined, I said. There are franchise agreements, board approvals, legal processes, none of which have happened. David's face turned red. Sophie, let's not make this uncomfortable. You already did that, I said. Then I turned to the others in the room. I've led this company for 10 years. Every expansion, every menu overhaul, every growth phase came from this table with your help. Now ask yourselves, do you really want to follow someone who's been in this business for 15 minutes just because his last name matches the sign out front? Silence. Maria looked down at her notes. Elise shifted in her chair. No one defended David, but no one spoke up either. I stood. This meeting is over. David's jaw clenched. You can't just walk out. I smiled coldly. Watch me. And I did. Back in my office, I sent 2 emails. One to our legal team, instructing them to notify the franchisees that no leadership change was authorized and that any communications from David or Frank were unofficial. The second, to the board. Subject: Emergency session request. Leadership challenge. I requested an emergency meeting. According to our bylaws, any board member with executive authority could call for one within 48 hours. I was within my rights, and I had documentation to back every move I made. But what I didn't have yet was certainty about where the board's loyalty lay. Frank had influence. He'd been one of the original co-founders. Some of the board members had known him for 20 years. And while they respected me, respect didn't always translate to votes. That evening, I called Luis again. How bad is it? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then, half the staff are watching to see who wins. The other half are hoping you do. And David? He's calling meetings, trying to win people over, talking about vision and fresh energy. But he's nervous. You can tell. I thanked him, hung up and sat in silence. This wasn't just about titles anymore. It was about trust, influence, control. And tomorrow I'd have to fight not just for my job, but for the soul of the company I built. Because Frank and David weren't backing down. They were just getting started. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom at 9 a.m., sharp. The air was colder than usual, heavy with pretense. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the 12 leather chairs around it were all occupied, except for mine. I took my seat at the far end. Across from me sat Frank, flanked by David. David looked nervous. He should have. He was out of his depth, and deep down, he knew it. But Frank? He looked composed, smug, like a man confident he had the votes lined up before the game even started. One by one, the board members greeted me with professional courtesy. Neutral, cautious. No one smiled. Then Charles Mitchell, our board chair, cleared his throat. I believe we all know why we're here, he said, His voice clipped. There's been a dispute regarding the role of managing director. Dispute, I repeated, almost under my breath. That's one word for it. He ignored me. Frank, since this request originated on your end, we'll begin with you. Frank stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He always did that before speaking, as if fabric could somehow lend authority. First, let me say that we are deeply grateful for everything Sophie has done for Sorella. Her dedication is undeniable. But as we look ahead to the next 25 years, we believe new leadership is essential. Someone with fresh ideas, a stronger public presence, and the ability to modernize our brand. He gestured to David. My son has been working closely with our marketing and social media teams for over a year. His recent campaign tripled engagement and brought in a younger demographic. This is the direction we need to go. I let him finish. Then I stood slowly. Thank you, Frank, I said, my voice steady. Now let's talk facts. I tapped the tablet in front of me, and the wall screen behind me lit up with data. Growth charts, revenue spikes, franchise expansion timelines. In the past 10 years, we've gone from one struggling restaurant to a 4-location franchise valued at over $5 million. That growth didn't happen because of viral Instagram posts. It happened because of operational strategy, risk management, vendor negotiations, and a team I personally built from the ground up. I turned to face the board. I didn't inherit this company. I rebuilt it. Every milestone you see on that screen, every contract, every renovation, every new hire, was approved and executed under my leadership. David shifted uncomfortably. He was starting to sweat. But let's set all of that aside, I continued, because this isn't about preference. It's about legality. I pulled up a second document. This is the franchise licensing agreement, signed in 2019 and updated in 2021. It clearly states that any change to operational leadership must be reviewed and approved by this board and accompanied by written cause. There was no review, and no cause. The room was silent. No one blinked. I know some of you are close with Frank. I respect that. But if you allow this kind of internal power grab, you're setting a precedent that undermines everything we've built. Then I paused, letting the next sentence land hard. And if I walk today, every franchise agreement goes with me. Gasps weren't common in boardrooms, but I got one. Charles leaned forward. You're saying you would revoke the licenses? I'm saying, I replied, that you'd be left with 4 properties, no operational continuity, no management infrastructure, and, most critically, no brand. Frank jumped in. This is extortion. This is business, I said calmly. The kind you forgot how to do a long time ago. Charles cleared his throat again. Let's move to a vote. Frank looked smug again. Too smug. That's when I knew. He'd gotten to someone. The votes came in, one by one. 4 for David, 3 for me, 2 abstained, 1 left. All eyes turned to Elise. She had always been neutral, finance first, non-confrontational. She looked at me, then at David, then down at her tablet. I vote in favor of Sophie, she said. Frank shot up. Elise. She cut him off. Enough, Frank. I've worked under both of them. Only one of them knows what they're doing. Final tally. 5-4. I had won, barely. As I gathered my things, I looked at David. You didn't lose because you're young, I said softly. You lost because you tried to skip the part where you earn it. Then I looked at Frank. And you? You forgot who was keeping your name on the building. I walked out of the boardroom into a hallway that suddenly felt warmer, lighter. But I knew better than to celebrate, because men like Frank don't lose quietly. And David wasn't going to disappear. They were going to try again. Only next time, they'd come at me from the outside. The board vote was done. I had won. But the victory felt fragile, like glass that could shatter under pressure. I knew Frank wasn't going to walk away with his pride bruised and his son publicly humiliated. That wasn't who he was. And I didn't have to wait long to find out exactly what he was planning next. 2 days later, the first article dropped. Leadership rift at Sorella. Sources say founder's daughter refused to step aside. The headline hit local business blogs first. Then it crept into national restaurant publications. The article was filled with vague, insider sources and cleverly phrased half-truths. It painted me as a power-hungry control freak, unwilling to embrace modern leadership or share credit with the next generation. There was no mention of the board vote, no mention of the contracts, no mention of the 10 years I spent rebuilding this company from the ground up. Just quotes like, "Some say she runs the business like a dictatorship." Others believe the brand needs a younger, more innovative voice. I stared at the screen, fists clenched on my desk. Frank was doing what he did best, reframing reality. And this time, he had help. Within hours, investors started calling. A few politely asked for clarification. Others weren't so polite. Should we be concerned about leadership instability? Is this why expansion into San Diego stalled? Is it true you refused to hire a chief marketing officer because you felt threatened? I took a deep breath before answering each one. Calm, measured, factual. But inside, I was seething. That evening, Luis knocked on my office door and stepped in quietly. "Word is," he said, "Frank's been calling vendors, asking if they'd work with David directly, hinting at a restructure." I leaned back in my chair. Of course he has. And one more thing, Luis added hesitantly. A few of the newer staff at the flagship, front of house, called out sick today. Same ones David hired. Might not be a coincidence. It wasn't. It was a message. He couldn't beat me inside the system, so now he was trying to make me look like I couldn't control my own business. Undermine morale, disrupt daily operations, rattle the board, and worst of all, make me doubt myself. But what Frank didn't understand was that I'd spent a decade in crisis mode. I'd dealt with burst pipes during dinner service, 3 lawsuits, 2 kitchen fires, and a global pandemic. He wanted a public war? Fine. The next morning, I scheduled a press release. No denials, no counter-smears, just facts. Sorella is proud to confirm its leadership structure remains unchanged following a routine board vote, with Sophie Harper continuing in her role as managing director. Under her leadership, the brand has expanded into 4 markets and grown revenue by over 350% in 10 years. The board remains confident in her vision for the future. It was short, precise, unapologetic. Then I called in my own favor, an old friend who worked as a producer on a regional business show. 3 days later, I sat down in a TV studio across from a well-known anchor. He introduced me as the woman behind one of the Midwest's fastest-growing restaurant franchises. "I have to ask," he said, leaning in with a smile. "What's your secret?" I smiled back. Relentless hard work, strategic growth, and learning to tune out the noise. He laughed. "That sounds like a subtle nod to some of the recent headlines." I kept my voice steady. "If doing my job well makes me difficult, I can live with that." The interview aired that evening, and for the first time in weeks, the narrative shifted. Investors stopped calling. Customers sent messages of support. Our Instagram saw a surge of engagement, not because of David's youthful energy, but because people respect resilience. But not everyone was pleased. That night, I received a message from an anonymous number. "Enjoy the spotlight. You've made enemies." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. Not because I wasn't rattled, but because I knew fear was the whole point. This wasn't just about contracts or press coverage anymore. Frank and David wanted to break me. Publicly. Personally. But they were forgetting something. I'd already survived the hardest part. Building everything from nothing. Now, I was just protecting what was mine. And I wasn't done yet. Because I had one more move left. One that would remind them exactly who they were dealing with. 2 weeks after the board vote, The media firestorm and the anonymous threats, the dust finally began to settle. But I hadn't. I was still working 16-hour days, still in my office before sunrise, still walking the kitchen line during dinner rush. But it wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was clarity, because I knew that if I wanted peace, real peace, I had to do more than just survive Frank and David's betrayal. I had to close the door behind them, for good. And I knew exactly how to do it. It started with a call to Elise, our finance director, the same board member whose vote had saved me. I want a full audit, I told her. Quiet, internal. Go back 5 years. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded. Got it. I had my suspicions. Little things I'd noticed over the years. Frank had always handled legacy accounts. The vendor contracts for our original Chicago suppliers had never been fully transitioned to my department. It was a gray area, one I had allowed out of respect. Loyalty. Now I knew better. 2 days later, Elise walked into my office holding a thick file. I didn't think you were right, she said, but you were. She dropped the folder on my desk. Inside, invoices, payment discrepancies, vendor kickbacks. Nothing explosive, but enough to show a clear pattern of self-dealing. Frank had been funneling a portion of the vendor rebates to a side company registered under his name, one that billed us for consulting. It wasn't illegal per se, but it was unethical, and a breach of our internal policy. And David? His name was on a few of the invoices, too. I sat in silence for a moment, then slowly picked up the phone. Elise, I said, still holding the file. Notify the board. We're calling a vote for removal. Just Frank? She asked. I looked down at David's signature. Both. 1 week later, we met again in the boardroom. Frank came in looking defiant. David looked exhausted. I know what this is, Frank said before the meeting began. This is personal. No, I replied. This is business. You taught me that, remember? I handed out the documents. I didn't need a big speech. The numbers spoke for themselves. Vendor kickbacks, false reimbursements, misappropriated funds. David tried to explain. Said he just signed what his father gave him. That he didn't know. I believed him. But that didn't mean I was going to protect him. The vote was swift. 8-1. Effective immediately, Frank and David were removed from all positions and privileges within Sorella. Frank's shares were frozen pending investigation. David's severance was denied. It was done. But I wasn't finished. That weekend, I hosted a staff meeting. No press, no PR spin, just our full team, packed into the flagship location. I want to tell you all something, I said, standing in front of the open kitchen. This restaurant isn't mine because my name is Harper. It's mine because I showed up when no one else did. Because I worked the fryers when we were short-staffed and mopped the floors when our dishwasher quit mid-shift. I know many of you did the same. And we're still here. Together. I paused, looking at familiar faces. Servers who'd been with us since the second location. Cooks who had followed me across state lines. We're not just rebuilding a brand anymore. We're protecting a legacy. One built with sweat, not signatures. Applause erupted. Not polite. Not forced. Real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since this all began. Relief. A year later, Sorella crossed $10 million in revenue. We opened in 2 new cities. We launched a training program for women in culinary leadership. And the board? Rebuilt, transparent, accountable. Frank never reached out again. David sent a short email once. No apology, just a line that read, "You were right." I wasn't ready. I didn't respond. Because closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from letting go of people who only show up when the credit rolls in. Now, when I walk through the original Chicago kitchen, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel pride. Not because I won, but because I stayed standing when everyone expected me to fold. Because I proved. Not to them, but to myself, that strength isn't inherited. It's built, dish by dish, shift by shift, contract by contract. So the next time someone asks me how I kept my company from being stolen, I'll tell them this. I didn't fight to stay in power. I fought to protect what I created from people who thought they could claim it without earning it. And that's something I'll never be sorry for.